Reading Truth in Lending Act. Happen to be reading it out of the Code of Federal Regulations. I'm in section 1026.38. And this section is titled Content of Disclosures for Certain Mortgage Transactions. In parentheses, you see it represents the closing disclosure. For each transaction subject to 1026.19F, which I believe is all closed and federally related mortgage loans, the creditor shall disclose the information in this section. General information. 1. Form title, the title of the form closing disclosure using that term. Form purpose, the following statement. This form is a statement of final loan terms and closing costs. Compare this document with your loan estimate. Closing information. Under the heading closing information, include the date issued, the closing date, and the disbursement date. The date of amounts disclosed pursuant to other sections are expected to be paid in a purchase transaction to the consumer and seller respectively as applicable, or the date the amounts disclosed pursuant to other sections are expected to be paid to the consumer or third party in a transaction that is not a purchase transaction. Settlement agent, file number, property, sale price. In credit transactions where there is no seller, the appraised value of the property identified shall be labeled appraised property value. The transaction information section under heading transaction information to include the borrower, seller, lender. Loan information under heading loan information to include the loan term, purpose, product, and loan type, and loan ID number, and mortgage insurance case number. Loan terms, B, in a separate section, including a separate table with the heading loan terms. Shall include those items required under 1026.37B. So luckily, we're not going to read them over again. We're just going to say it's going to be an identical table, but may reflect more accurate information. Letter C, projected payments. A separate table under the heading projected payments that includes and satisfies the following information and requirements. 1. Projected payments or range of payments. The information to be disclosed pursuant to 1026.37C1 through 4 other than C4 Roman numeral 4, and disclosing estimated escrow payments as described in section 1026.37C2 Roman numeral 3 and C4 Roman numeral 2, the amount disclosed on the closing disclosure. Roman numeral 1, for transactions subject to RESPA, is determined under the escrow account analysis described in RESPA. For transactions not subject to RESPA, may be determined under the escrow account analysis described in RESPA anyway, or in a manner set forth under 1026.37C5. 2. Estimated taxes, insurance, and assessments. This is all still under letter C, projected payments. Letter D, cost at closing. Cost at closing table number 1 in a separate table under the heading cost at closing. Labeled closing costs, the sum of the dollar amounts disclosed pursuant to paragraphs F4, G5, and H3 of this section, together with a statement that the amount disclosed pursuant to paragraph D1I of this section includes amounts disclosed pursuant to paragraphs F4, G5, and H3 of this section. Also, the dollar amount disclosed pursuant to F4 of this section labeled loan costs. The dollar amount disclosed pursuant to paragraph G5 of the section labeled other costs, and the dollar amount disclosed pursuant to paragraph H3 of the section labeled lender credits, and E, a statement referring the consumer to the tables disclosed pursuant to paragraphs F and G of the section for details Roman numeral 2 under cost at closing table, labeled cash to close, the sum of the dollar amounts calculated in accordance with paragraphs I-9 Roman numeral 2 of this section, together with a statement that the amount disclosed pursuant to paragraph D1 Roman numeral 2 of a section includes the amount disclosed pursuant to paragraph D1 Roman numeral 1 of the section, and B, a statement referring the consumer to the table required pursuant to paragraph I of this section for details. Number 2 is an alternative table for transactions without a seller. For transactions that do not involve a seller and where the creditor disclosed the optimal alternative table pursuant to 1026.37D2, the creditor shall disclose with the label cash to close instead of the sum of the dollar amounts described in paragraph D1 Roman numeral 2 of this section, I through Roman numeral 3, the amount calculated in accordance with paragraph E5 Roman numeral 2 of this section. Roman numeral 2, a statement of whether the disclosed amount is from or to the consumer, and Roman numeral 3, a statement referring the consumer to the table required pursuant to paragraph E of this section for details. Which letter E is next? This is titled Alternative Calculating Cash to Close Table for Transactions Without a Seller. For transactions that do not involve a seller and where the creditor disclosed the optional alternative table pursuant to the section I believe I just read, the creditor shall disclose instead of the table described in paragraph I of this section in a separate table under the heading Calculating Cash to Close together with this statement. Use this table to see what has changed from your loan estimate. Number 1, loan amount, labeled loan amount, Roman numeral 1, under the subheading loan estimate, the loan amount disclosed on the loan estimate. Under the subheading final, the loan amount disclosed in paragraph B of this section, and Roman numeral 3 disclosed more prominently than the other disclosures under E1 Roman numeral 1 and 2 of this section under the subheading did this change. A, if the amount disclosed under paragraph E1 Roman numeral 2 of a section is different than the amount disclosed under E1 Roman numeral 1 of this section, unless the difference is due to rounding, the statement of the fact along with the statement of whether it is an increase or a decrease, or B, if the amount disclosed is equal, a statement of that fact. Now, the same comparison goes for total closing costs and other cost subtotals disclosed under paragraph F4 and G5 of the section. If the increase exceeds the limitations on increases in closing costs under 1026.19E3, a statement that such increase exceeds the legal limits by the dollar amount of the excess, and if any refund is provided pursuant to 1026.19F2 Roman numeral V5, a statement directing the consumer to the disclosure required under paragraph H3 of this section. Such dollar amount shall equal the sum total of all excesses of the limitation on increase in closing costs under 1026.19E3, taking into account the different methods of calculating excesses of the limitations on increases in closing costs under 1026.19E3 and Roman numeral 2. B, if the amount disclosed under paragraph E2 Roman numeral 1 of the section is equal, instead, then state that fact. The same comparison needs to be done for closing costs paid before closing, as well as payoffs and payments, as well as cash to or from the consumer, closing costs financed, this time labeled closing costs finance paid from your loan account, the sum of the amounts disclosed in paragraphs E1 Roman numeral 2 and E4 Roman numeral 2 of this paragraph, but only to the extent that the sum is greater than 0 or less than or equal to the sum disclosed under paragraph H1 of the section minus the sum disclosed under paragraph H2 of the section designated borrower paid before closing. F is a separate section. Closing cost details, loan costs. Under the master heading, closing cost details, with columns stating whether the charge was borrower paid at or before closing, seller paid or at or before closing, or paid by others, all loan costs associated with the transaction listed in the table under the heading loan cost. The table shall contain the items and amounts listed in the four headings under four subheadings described in paragraphs F1 through 5 of this section. So we're in F right now. 1 is origination charges. 2 is services borrower did not shop for. 3 is services borrower did shop for. And 4 is the total loan cost. 5 actually is the subtotal of the loan costs. So what's being said about origination charges? We itemize each amount paid for charges from the last section. The amount of compensation paid by the creditor to a third-party loan originator, along with the name of the loan originator ultimately receiving the payment, and the total of all such itemized amounts that are designated borrower paid at or before closing. 2, services borrower did not shop for. An itemization of services and corresponding costs for each of the settlement services required by the creditor for which the consumer did not shop for in accordance with 102619E1 Roman numeral 4A, and that are provided by persons other than the creditor or mortgage broker, the name of the person ultimately receiving the payment for such amount, each such amount, and total of all such itemized amounts that are designated borrower paid at or before closing. Items that were disclosed pursuant to 102637 F3 must be disclosed under this paragraph. F2, if the consumer was provided a written list of settlement service providers and the consumer selected a settlement service provider contained on that written list. Third, services the borrower did not shop for is relatively the same language. An itemization of services and corresponding costs for each of the settlement services required by the creditor for which the consumer shopped in accordance with 102619E and that are provided by persons other than the creditor or mortgage broker, the name of the person ultimately receiving the payment for such payment, and the total of all such itemized costs that are designated borrower paid at or before closing. Items that were disclosed pursuant to the previous section must be disclosed under paragraphs F3. Well, actually, not the previous section, I should say the loan estimate must be disclosed under F3 if the consumer was provided a written list of settlement service providers and the consumer did not select a settlement service provider contained on that written list. 4 is the total loan cost. Under a subheading, total loan cost borrower paid, the sum of the amounts disclosed as borrower paid pursuant to paragraph F5 of the section, which is the subtotal of loan costs, reading it right now, calculated by totaling the amounts described in paragraphs F1 through 3 of the section for costs designated borrower paid at or before closing, labeled loan cost subtotals. Letter G of this section. I'll hold off on reading that because I have a call. I'm trying so hard to finish reading Subpart E. I'm in section 1026.38 about the closing disclosure. I'm talking about taxes and other government fees under the subheading taxes and other government fees, and in the applicable column as described in paragraph G of this section, an itemization of each amount that is expected to be paid to state and local governments for taxes and government fees and the total of such itemized amounts that are designated borrower paid at or before closing as follows. We have Roman numeral 1, recording fees and amounts paid in the applicable columns, and 2, an itemization of transfer taxes with the name of the government entity assessing the transfer tax. We have number 2, prepaids, under the subheading prepaids and in the applicable column as described in paragraph G of this section. An itemization of each amount for charges described in 1026.37G2, the name of the person ultimately receiving the payment or government entity assessing the property tax, provided that the person ultimately receiving the payment need not be disclosed for the disclosure required by 1026.37G2 Roman numeral 3, when disclosed pursuant to the paragraph, and the total of all such itemized amounts that are designated borrower paid at or before closing. Number 3, and this is under G, letter G, closing cost details, other costs. Number 3 is the initial escrow payment at closing. Under the subheading initial escrow payment at closing and in the applicable column, as described in paragraph G of this section, itemization is of each amount for charges described in 1026.37G3, the applicable aggregate adjustment pursuant to RESPA, along with the label aggregate adjustment, and the total of all such itemized amounts that are designated borrower paid at or before closing. Number 4, under other costs in the closing cost disclosure, other, under the subheading other and in the applicable column as designated in paragraph G of this section, an itemization of each amount for charges in connection with the transaction that are in addition to the charges disclosed under paragraph F and G1 through 3 for services that are required or obtained in a real estate closing by the consumer, the seller, or other party, the name of the person ultimately receiving the payment, and the total of all such itemized amounts that are designated borrower paid at or before closing. Roman numeral 1, for any cost that is a component of title insurance services, the introductory description title shall appear at the beginning of the label for that actual cost. The parenthetical description optional shall appear at the end of the label for cost designated borrower paid at or before closing for any premiums paid for separate insurance, warranty, guarantee, or event coverage products. Number 5 under other costs is total other costs. Closing disclosure other costs is total other costs. Under the subheading total other costs borrower paid, the sum of the amounts disclosed is borrower paid pursuant to paragraph G6 of the section. Number 6, subtotal of costs, the sum of other costs calculated by totaling the costs disclosed under paragraphs G1 through 4 of the section designated borrower paid at or before closing labeled other costs subtotals. Letter H, closing cost totals. 1. The sum of the costs disclosed as borrower paid pursuant to paragraph H2 of this section and the amount disclosed in paragraph H3 of this section under the subheading total closing costs borrower paid. Number 2, the sum of the amounts disclosed in paragraphs F5 and G6 of this section designated borrower paid at or before closing, and the sum of the costs designated seller paid at or before closing or paid by others disclosed pursuant to paragraphs F and G of this section labeled closing cost subtotals. 3. The amount described in 1026.37G6 Roman numeral 2 is a negative number labeled lender credits and designated borrower paid at closing, and if a refund is provided pursuant to 1026.19F2 Roman numeral 5, a statement that this amount includes a credit for an amount that exceeds the limitations on increases in closing costs under 1026.19E3, and the amount of such credit under 1026.19F2 Roman numeral 5. Number 4 under G, which I believe is trying to total the other costs or total all of the costs. The services and costs disclosed pursuant to paragraphs F and G of this section on the closing disclosure shall be labeled using terminology that describes the item disclosed in a manner that is consistent with the descriptions or prescribed labels as applicable used for such items on the loan estimate pursuant to 1026.37. The creditor must also list the items on the closing disclosure in the same sequential order as on the loan estimate pursuant to 1026.37. And letter I, calculating cash to close, in a separate table under the heading calculating cash to close together with the statement, use this table to see what has changed from your loan estimate. Number 1, total closing costs. Roman numeral 1, under the subheading loan estimate, the total closing costs disclosed on the loan estimate under 1026.37H1I, labeled using that term. Roman numeral 2, under the subheading final, the amount disclosed under paragraph H1 of the section. Did it change, and if so, whether it was due to rounding? If not, a statement of that fact. 2, if the difference in the total closing cost is attributable to differences in itemized charges that are included in either or both subtotals, a statement that the consumer should see the total loan costs and total other cost subtotals disclosed in paragraphs F4 and G5 of the section together with references to such disclosures as applicable. And 3, if the increase exceeds limitations on increases in closing costs under the section that's going to say it's by 10%, a statement that such increase exceeds the legal limits by the dollar amount of the excess, and if any refund is provided pursuant to that section, a statement directing the consumer the disclosure required under paragraph H3 of the section, such dollar amount shall equal the sum total of all excesses of the limitations on increases in closing costs, taking into account the different methods of calculating excesses of the limitations on increases in closing costs. B, under what? B? So that was 1 through 3 under A, where there's differences in, I guess, the total closing costs. Now I'm reading B. If the amount disclosed under paragraph letter I, 1, Roman numeral 2 of this section is subject to the amount disclosed under paragraph 1, I, 1, whatever, of this section, the statement of that fact. Number 2, closing costs paid before closing, and the comparison and whether it changed. There isn't any specific instructions as to what to do if it changed, but just bringing the customer's attention to the fact. Number 3, the same comparisons being completed for the closing costs financed. You're comparing it to be specific from the closing disclosure to the loan estimate. And same goes for down payment funds from borrower, whether or not it changed. If the amount disclosed is different than the amount disclosed under the loan estimate, unless the difference is due to rounding, a statement of the fact along with the statement that the consumer increased or decreased his payment and that the consumer should see the details disclosed under letter J as applicable, or if the numbers are the same, a disclosure of the fact. 5, the same comparison is being done for deposit. The same comparison is being done for funds for the borrower. Funds from the borrower is to be disclosed as funds for borrower to be, wait, I'm so confused. Wait, hold on. Alright, number 6 is funds for the borrower. And you compare to see whether or not they're the same. Or not. And disclose that fact. I think Roman numeral 4 is okay, Roman numeral 4 is still within the section funds for the borrower, but it says the funds from borrower to be disclosed under paragraph I of this section and funds for borrower to be disclosed in a different part of paragraph I of the section are determined by subtracting the principal amount of the credit extended, excluding any amount disclosed pursuant to paragraph I of the section from the total amount of all existing debt being satisfied in the real estate closing and disclosed under paragraph J of the section, except to the extent the satisfaction of such existing debt is disclosed under paragraph G of this section. If the calculation just explained yields an amount that is a positive number, such amount shall be disclosed and 0 shall be disclosed. If the calculation just described yields an amount that's a negative number, such amount shall be disclosed stated as a negative number, and 0 shall be disclosed under another paragraph. If the calculation just described yields 0, then 0 should be disclosed. Number 7, the comparison and the difference of the seller credits is disclosed. The fact whether there's a difference or not. Number 8, same goes for the adjustments and other credits, determining whether or not they changed in the statement of that fact. Cash to close is treated the same way. Now we've come to letter J, which is the summary of borrower's transaction. Under the heading Summaries of Transactions, with a statement to use this table to see a summary of your transaction, 2 separate tables are disclosed. The first table shall include, under subheading Borrower's Transaction, the following information and shall satisfy the following requirements. 1. Itemization of amounts due from borrower. The total amount due from the consumer at closing, calculated as the sum of items required to be disclosed in paragraph J. 1. Roman numeral 2 through X of this section, excluding items paid from funds other than closing funds as described in paragraph J4I of this section, labeled due from borrower at closing. Roman numeral 2, the amount of the contract sales price of the property being sold in a purchase real estate transaction, excluding the price of any tangible personal property if the consumer and seller have agreed to a separate price for such items, labeled sale price of property. Roman numeral 3, the amount of the sales price of any tangible personal property excluded from the contract sales price pursuant to paragraph J1, Roman numeral 2 of the section, labeled sale price of any personal property included in sale. Roman numeral 4, the total amount of closing costs disclosed that are designated borrower paid at closing, calculated pursuant to paragraph H2 of the section, labeled closing costs paid at closing. Roman numeral 5, a description of the amount of any additional items that the seller has paid prior to the real estate closing but reimbursed by the consumer at the real estate closing, and a description of the amount for any other items owed by the consumer at the real estate closing not otherwise disclosed pursuant to paragraph F, G, or J of this section. Roman numeral 6, the description and adjustments for items paid by the seller in advance. Roman numeral 7, the prorated amount of any prepaid taxes due from the consumer to reimburse the seller at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount, labeled city-town taxes. Roman numeral 8, the prorated amount of any prepaid taxes due from the consumer to reimburse the seller at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount, labeled county taxes. Roman numeral 9, the prorated amount of any prepaid assessments due from the consumer to reimburse the seller at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount, labeled assessments. And Roman numeral 10, a description and the amount of any additional items paid by the seller prior to the real estate closing that are due from the consumer at the real estate closing. And number 2, itemization of amounts already paid by or on behalf of the borrower. Roman numeral 1, the sum of the amounts disclosed in this paragraphs J to Roman numeral 2 through Roman numeral 11 of the section, excluding items paid from funds other than closing funds as described in paragraph J4.1 of the section, labeled paid already by or on behalf of borrower at closing. Roman numeral 2, any amount under number 2, which is itemization of amounts already paid by or on behalf of the borrower. Roman numeral 2, any amount that is paid to the seller or held in trust or escrow by an attorney or other party under the terms of the agreement for the sale of the property, labeled deposit. Roman numeral 3, the amount of the consumer's new loan amount or first user loan as described pursuant to paragraph B of the section, labeled loan amount. Roman numeral 4, the amount of any existing loan that the consumer is assuming or any loans subject to which the consumer is taking title to the property, labeled existing loans assumed or taken subject to. Roman numeral 5, the total amount of money that the seller will provide at the real estate closing as a lump sum not otherwise itemized to pay for loan costs as determined by paragraph F of this section and other costs as determined by paragraph G of this section, and any other obligations of the seller to be paid directly to the consumer, labeled seller credit. Roman numeral 6, this description, other credits, together with a description and amount of other items paid by or on behalf of the consumer and not otherwise disclosed pursuant to paragraphs F, G, H, and J2 of this section, Roman numeral 7, the description adjustments for items unpaid by the seller, Roman numeral 8, the prorated amount of any unpaid taxes due from the seller to reimburse the consumer at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount labeled city-town taxes, Roman numeral 9, the prorated amount of any unpaid taxes due from the seller to reimburse the consumer at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount labeled county taxes, Roman numeral 10, the prorated amount of any unpaid assessments due from the seller to reimburse the consumer at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount labeled assessments, and Roman numeral 11, a description of the amount of any additional items which have not yet been paid and which the consumer is expected to pay after the real estate closing, but which are attributable in part to a period of time prior to the real estate closing. Number 3, calculation of borrower's transaction under the label calculation is also under letter J. Roman numeral 1, under number 3, the amount disclosed pursuant to J1 Roman numeral I of this section labeled total due from borrower at closing. Roman numeral 2, the amount disclosed pursuant to paragraph J2I of this section, if any, disclosed as a negative number, labeled total paid already by or on behalf of borrower at closing. And Roman numeral 3, a statement that the disclosed amount is due from or to the consumer and the amount due from or to the consumer at the real estate closing calculated by the sum of the amounts disclosed under paragraph J3 Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 of this section labeled cash to close. Number 4, items paid outside of closing funds. Roman numeral 1, costs that are not paid from closing funds that but that would otherwise be disclosed in the table required pursuant to paragraph J of this section should be marked with the phrase paid outside of closing or the abbreviation POC and include the name of the party making the payment. Roman numeral 2, for purposes of this paragraph J, closing funds means funds collected and dispersed at real estate closing. Letter K, summary of the seller's transaction. Under the heading Summaries of Transactions required by paragraph J of this section, a separate table under the subheading Seller's Transaction that includes the following information satisfies the following requirements. This includes number 1, the itemization of amounts due to the seller. The total amount due to the seller at the real estate closing calculated as the sum of the items required to be disclosed pursuant to paragraph K1, Roman numeral 2 through Roman numeral 9 of this section, excluding items paid from funds other than closing funds as described in paragraph K4I of this section labeled due to seller at closing. Roman numeral 2, under itemizations of amounts due to the seller, you have the amount of the contract sales price of the property being sold, excluding the price of any tangible personal property if the consumer and seller have agreed to a separate price for such items labeled sale price of property. Roman numeral 3, the amount of the sales price of any tangible personal property excluded from the contract sales price pursuant to paragraph K1 Roman numeral 2 of this section labeled sale price of any personal property included in sale. Roman numeral 4, description and the amount of other items paid to the seller by the consumer pursuant to the contract of sale or other agreement, such as charges that were not disclosed pursuant to 102637 on the loan estimate, or items paid by the seller prior to the real estate closing, but reimbursed by the consumer at the real estate closing. Roman numeral 5, the description adjustments for items paid by seller in advance. Roman numeral 6, the prorated amount of any taxes due from the consumer to reimburse the seller at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount labeled city or town taxes. Roman numeral 7, the prorated amount of any prepaid taxes due from the consumer to reimburse the seller at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount labeled county taxes. Roman numeral 8, the prorated amount of any prepaid assessments due from the consumer to reimburse the seller at the real estate closing and at the time period corresponding to that amount labeled assessments, and a description of the amount of the additional items paid by the seller prior to real estate closing that are reimbursed by the consumer at the real estate closing. Number 2, under letter K, if I remember correctly, we have itemization of amounts due from the seller. Starting with Roman numeral 1, the total amount due from the seller at the real estate closing calculated as the sum of items required to be disclosed pursuant to paragraph K2 Roman numeral 2 through Roman numeral 13 of this section, excluding items paid from funds other than closing funds as described in paragraph K for Roman numeral 1 of this section labeled due from seller at closing. Roman numeral 2, the amount of any excess deposit dispersed to the seller prior to the real estate closing labeled excess deposit. Roman numeral 3, the amount of closing costs designated seller paid at closing disclosed pursuant to paragraph H2 of this section labeled closing costs paid at closing. Roman numeral 4, the amount of any existing loans that the consumer is assuming or any loans subject to which the consumer is taking title of the property labeled existing loans assumed or taken subject to. Roman numeral 5, the amount of any loan secured by a first lien on the property that will be paid off as part of the real estate closing labeled payoff of first mortgage loan. Roman numeral 6, the amount of any loan subject by a second lien on a property that will be paid off as part of a real estate closing labeled payoff of a second mortgage loan. Roman numeral 7, the total amount of money that the seller will provide at the real estate closing as a lump sum, not otherwise itemized, to pay for loan costs as determined by paragraph F of this section, and other costs as determined by paragraph G of this section, and any other obligations of the seller to be paid directly to the consumer labeled seller credit. Roman numeral 8, a description and amount of any and all other obligations required to be paid by the seller at the real estate closing, including any lien-related payoffs, fees, or obligations. Roman numeral 9, the description adjustments for items unpaid by seller. Roman numeral 10, the prorated amount of any unpaid taxes due from the seller to reimburse the consumer at the real estate closing in the time period corresponding to that amount labeled city or town taxes. Roman numeral 11, the prorated amount of any unpaid taxes due from the seller to the consumer at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount labeled county taxes. Roman numeral 12, the prorated amount of any unpaid assessments due from the seller to reimburse the consumer at the real estate closing and the time period corresponding to that amount labeled assessments. Roman numeral 13, a description and the amount of any additional items which have not yet been paid and which the consumer is expected to pay after the real estate closing, but which are attributable in part to a period of time prior to the real estate closing. Number 3, calculation of seller's transaction under the label calculation. Roman numeral 1, the amount described in paragraph 1, K1 room I of this section labeled total due to seller at closing. Roman numeral 2, the amount described in paragraph K2I of this section discloses a negative number labeled total due from seller at closing. And Roman numeral 3, a statement that the disclosed amount is due from or to the seller and the amount due from or to the seller at closing calculated by the sum of the amounts disclosed pursuant to paragraph K3I or Roman numeral 2 of this section labeled cash. Number 4, items paid outside of closing costs. Roman numeral 1, charges that are not paid from closing costs but that would otherwise be disclosed in the table described in paragraph K of this section should be marked with the phrase paid outside of closing or the acronym and include a statement of the party making the payment. Roman numeral 2, for purposes of paragraph K, closing funds are defined as funds collected and dispersed at the real estate closing. Letter L, loan disclosures. Under the master heading, additional information about this loan, and under the heading loan disclosures, we discuss the assumption and whether it's available to the consumer at a later date. Demand feature is disclosed, and a statement of whether the legal obligation permits the creditor to demand early repayment of the loan, and if the statement is affirmative, a reference to the note or other loan contract for details. The late payment, negative amortization. Under the subheading negative amortization, increase in loan amount, a statement of whether the regular periodic payment may cause the principal balance to increase. And Roman numeral 1 and 2. 1, if the regular periodic payment does not cover all of the interest due, the creditor must provide a statement that the principal balance will increase. Such balance will likely become larger than the original loan amount, and increases in such balance lower the consumer's equity in the property. Roman numeral 2, if the consumer may make regular periodic payments that do not cover all the interest due, the creditor must provide a statement that if the consumer chooses a monthly payment option that does not cover all of the interest due, the principal balance may become larger than the original loan amount, and the increases in the principal balance lower the consumer's equity in the property. Number 5, partial payment policy. Under the subheading partial payments, Roman numeral 1, if the periodic payments that are less than a full amount due are accepted, the statement that the creditor using the term lender may accept partial payments and apply such payments to the consumer's loan. Roman numeral 2, if periodic payments that are less than the full amount due are accepted but not applied to the consumer's loan until the consumer pays the remainder of the full amount due, a statement that the creditor using the term lender may hold partial payments in a separate account until the consumer pays the remainder of the payment and then apply the full periodic payment to the consumer's loan. Roman numeral number 3, if periodic payments that are less than the full amount due are not accepted, a statement that the creditor using the term lender does not accept any partial payments. And Roman numeral 4, a statement that if the loan is sold, the new creditor using the term lender may have a different policy. Number 6, security interest. Under the subheading security interest, a statement that the consumer is granting a security interest in the property securing the transaction, the property address, including zip code, and a statement that the consumer may lose the property if the consumer does not make the required payments or satisfy other requirements under the legal obligation. Number 7, escrow account. Under the subheading escrow account, Roman numeral 1, under the reference for now, a statement that an escrow account may also be called an impound or trust account, a statement of whether the creditor has established or will establish at or before consummation an escrow account in connection with the transaction for the costs that will be paid using escrow account funds described in paragraph L earlier of this section. A statement that the creditor may be liable for penalties and interest if it fails to make payment for any cost for which the escrow account is established, a statement that the consumer would have to pay such costs directly in the absence of an escrow account, and the table titled escrow that contains if an escrow account is or will be established, an itemization of the following 1 through 5. 1. The total amount the consumer will be required to pay into an escrow account over the first year after consummation for payment of the changes described in 102637, labeled escrow property costs over 1 year, together with a descriptive name of each such charge calculated as the amount disclosed under paragraph L. I'm about to go over it, part 4 of this section. And 2, the estimated amount of this section multiplied by the number of periodic payments scheduled to be made to the escrow account during the first year after consummation. Number 2, the estimated amount the consumer is likely to pay during the first year after consummation for charges described in 102637C4 Roman numeral 2 that are known to the creditor and that will not be paid using escrow account funds labeled non-escrowed property costs over year 1, together with a descriptive name of each such charge and a statement that the consumer may have to pay other costs that are not listed. Number 3, and this is all under L7 Roman numeral 1. Number 3 reads the total amount disclosed pursuant to paragraph G3 of the section, a statement that the payment is a cushion for the escrow account labeled initial escrow payment, and the reference to the information disclosed pursuant to paragraph G3 of the section. 4. Under L Roman numeral 1, the amount the consumer will be required to pay into the escrow account with each periodic payment during the first year after consummation for payment of the charges described in 102637C4 Roman numeral 2 labeled monthly escrow payment. And lastly, number 5, a creditor complies with the requirements of paragraphs L7 IA1 and 4 of the section if the creditor bases the numerical disclosures required by those paragraphs in amounts derived from the escrow account analysis required under RESPA. B. A statement of whether the consumer will not have an escrow account, the reason why the escrow account will not be established, a statement that the consumer must pay all property costs such as taxes and homeowners insurance directly, a statement that the consumer may contact the creditor to inquire about the availability of an escrow account, and a table titled No Escrow that contains if an escrow account will not be established, an itemization of the following. 1. The estimated total amount the consumer will pay directly for charges described earlier during the first year after consummation that are known to the creditor, and a statement that without an escrow account the consumer must pay the identified costs possibly in 1 or 2 large payments labeled property costs over year 1, and 2. The amount of any fee the creditor imposes on the consumer for not establishing an escrow account in connection with the transaction labeled escrow waiver fee. Roman numeral 2 under the reference in the future. So that was under Roman numeral 1, that's right now. And in the future, A, a statement that the consumer's property cost may change and that as a result the consumer's escrow payment may change. B, a statement that the consumer may be able to cancel any escrow account that has been established but that the consumer is responsible for directly paying all property costs in the absence of an escrow account. And a description that of the consequences if the consumer fails to pay property costs, including the actions that a state or local government may take in property taxes are not paid, and the actions the creditor may take if the consumer does not pay all or some property costs, such as adding amounts to the loan balance, adding an escrow account to the loan, or purchasing property insurance policy on the consumer's behalf that may be more expensive and provide fewer benefits than what the consumer may obtain directly. Letter M, adjustable payment table. Under the master heading, additional information about this loan required by paragraph L of this section, and under the heading adjustable payment AP table, the table required to be disclosed by 102637I. Letter N, adjustable interest rate table. Under the master heading, additional information about this loan required by paragraph L of this section, and under the heading adjustable interest rate AIR table, the table required to be disclosed under 1026.37J. Letter O, loan calculations. In a separate table under the heading loan calculations, 1, the total of payments, and 2, the finance charge, 3, the amount financed, and 4, the annual percentage rate. So this is all of your normal TILA disclosures. Oh my gosh. Okay. Total of payments. Number 1, the total of payments using the term and expressed as a dollar amount in a statement that the disclosure is a total the consumer will have paid after making all payments of principal, interest, mortgage, insurance, and loan costs as scheduled. Finance charge. The finance charge, using that term and expressed as a dollar amount on the following statement: the dollar amount the loan will cost you. The disclosed finance charge and other disclosures affected by the disclosed finance charge, including the amount financed and the APR, shall be treated as accurate if the amount disclosed as the finance charge is understated by no more than $100 or is greater than the amount required to be disclosed. Number 3, amount finance. The amount finance, using that term, expresses a dollar amount and the following statement: the loan amount available after paying your upfront finance charge. APR. The APR, using that term and abbreviated APR and expressed as a percentage, and the following statement: your cost over the loan term expressed as a rate. This is not your interest rate. Number 5, total interest percentage. This is that new calc. Using the term and abbreviation TIP and expressed as a percentage, and the following statement: the total amount of interest you will pay over the loan term as a percentage of your loan amount. Other disclosures. Under a heading Other Disclosures is your 1, appraisal disclosure, 2, contract details, 3, liability after disclosure, 4, refinance, 5, tax deductions. For appraisals for transactions subject to another U.S. code as implemented in this part, or Reg B, respectively, under the subheading appraisal, you're making the Reg B appraisals disclosure that if there was an appraisal of a property in connection with the loan, the creditor is required to provide the consumer with a copy at no additional cost to the consumer at least 3 days prior to consummation. And if the consumer has not yet received a copy of the appraisal, the consumer should contact the creditor using the information disclosed pursuant to paragraph R of this section. 2, contract details. A statement that the consumer should refer to the appropriate loan document security instrument for information about non-payment and what constitutes a default under the legal obligation, circumstances under which this creditor may accelerate the maturity of the obligation, and prepayment rebates and penalties under the subheading contract details. Number 3, liability after disclosure. A brief statement of whether and the conditions under which the consumer may remain responsible for any deficiency after foreclosure under applicable state law. A brief statement that certain protections may be lost if the consumer refinances or incurs additional debt on the property. And a statement that the consumer should consult an attorney for additional information under the subheading liability after disclosure. 4, refinance. Under the subheading refinance, a statement required under 102637M5. And 5, tax deductions. Under the subheading tax deductions, a statement that if the extension of credit exceeds the fair market value of the property, the interest on the portion in the credit extension that is greater than the fair market value of the property is not tax deductible for federal income tax purposes, and a statement that the consumer should consult a tax advisor for further information. Q is a questions notice. In a separate notice labeled questions, question mark, 1 through 3, a statement directing the consumer to use the contact information disclosed under paragraph R of this section if the consumer has any questions about the disclosures required pursuant to these sections. 2, a reference to the Bureau's website for information or to submit a complaint and the link or uniform resource locator address to the website. And lastly, a prominent question mark. Letter R is contact information. In a separate table under the heading contact information, the following information for each creditor under the subheading lender, mortgage broker under the subheading mortgage broker, consumer's real estate broker under subheading real estate broker B, seller's real estate broker under the subheading real estate broker S, the settlement agent under subheading settlement agent participating in the transaction. 1, the name of the person labeled name, address using that label, and the NMLS ID number labeled NMLS ID, or if none, license number or other unique identifier used by the applicable jurisdiction or regulating body with which the person is licensed or registered labeled license ID, and the abbreviation for the state of the applicable jurisdiction or regulatory body stated before the word license and the label for the persons identified in paragraph R1 of this section. Number 4, name of the natural person who is a primary contact for the consumer with the person identified in paragraph R1 of this section labeled contact. 5, NMLS ID labeled contact NMLS ID, or if none, license number or other unique identifier issued by the applicable jurisdiction or regulating party with which the person is licensed and or registered labeled contract license ID, and the abbreviation of the state of the applicable jurisdiction or regulatory body stated before the word license in the label for the natural person identified in paragraph R4 of this section. Email address for the person identified in paragraph R4 of this section labeled email, and 7, telephone number of the person identified in paragraph R4 of this section labeled phone. Letter S is the signature statement. 1, at the creditor's option under the heading confirm receipt, a line for the signatures of the consumers in the transaction. If the creditor provides a line for the consumer's signature, the creditor must disclose above the signature line the statement required to be disclosed under 1026.37 and 1. Number 2, if the creditor does not provide a line for the consumer's signature, the statement required to be disclosed under 1026.37 and 2 under the heading other disclosures required by paragraph P of this section. It goes on. T, form of disclosures. Number 1, general requirements. I, a creditor shall make the disclosures required by this section clearly and conspicuously in writing in a form the consumer can keep. The disclosures can also be grouped together and segregated from everything else. Also shall be grouped together and segregated from everything else. Roman numeral 2, under T, the form of disclosures. Except as provided in paragraph T5, the disclosure shall contain only the information required in paragraphs A through S of the section, and shall be made in the same order and position relative to the master headings, subheadings, labels, and similar designations in the same manner, as shown in Appendix H, Form H25. 2, headings and labels. If a master heading, subheading, label, or similar designation contains the word estimated or a capital letter designated in Form H-25 set forth in Appendix H to this part, the heading, label, or similar designation shall contain the word estimated and the applicable capital letter designation. Number 3, form except as provided in paragraph T5 of this section. I, for a transaction subject to 1026.19F, that is a federally related mortgage loan, as defined in RESPA, the disclosures must be made using H25 set forth in Appendix H2. For any other transaction subject to this transaction, the disclosures must be made with headings, content, and format similar to H25. And 3, the disclosures required by this section may be provided to the consumer in electronic form, subject to e-sign. As far as rounding, in number 4 to the nearest dollar, we have described the dollar amounts required to be disclosed under paragraph B of this section that are required to be rounded by letter O under part 37 and B 6 and 7. B, the dollar amounts required when to be disclosed under disclosed by paragraph C of this section that are required to be rounded by 1026.37, letter O for Roman numeral 1A when disclosed under 1026.37, letter C, number 1, Roman numeral 3. C, the dollar amounts required to be disclosed under paragraphs E and I of this section under the subheading loan estimate, and D, the dollar amounts required to be disclosed under paragraph M of this section, and E, the dollar amounts required to be disclosed under paragraph C of this section that are required to be rounded by 1026.37, letter O for Roman numeral 1C when disclosed under 1026.37 C2, Roman numeral number 4. Percentages is Roman numeral 2. The percentage amounts required to be disclosed in paragraphs B, F1, N, and O5 of this section shall not be rounded and shall be disclosed up to 2 to 3 decimal places. The percentage amount required to be disclosed in paragraph O4 of this section shall not be rounded and shall be disclosed up to 3 decimal places. If the amount is a whole number, then the amount disclosed shall be truncated at the decimal point. Loan amount. The total amount required to be disclosed by paragraph B of this section is required by 1026.37b1 shall be disclosed as an unrounded number, except that the amount is a whole number, then the amount disclosed shall be truncated at the decimal point. Exceptions. Number 5, Roman numeral 1, unit period, wherever the form or the section uses monthly to describe the frequency of any payments or uses month to describe the applicable unit period, the creditor shall substitute the appropriate term to reflect the fact that the transaction's terms provide for other than monthly periodic payments, such as bi-weekly or quarterly payments. Roman numeral 2, letter credits. The amount required to be disclosed by paragraph D1, Roman numeral 1D of this section may be omitted from the form if the amount is 0. Roman numeral 3, administrative information. The creditor may insert at the bottom of each page under the disclosures required by this section and as illustrated in page 25 of the appendix. Any administrative information, text, or codes that assist the identification of the form or information disclosed on the form provided at the space provided for any of the information required by this section is not altered. Roman numeral 4, closing cost details. A, additional line numbers. Line numbers provided on forms H25 of Appendix H to this part for the disclosure of information required by paragraphs F1 through 3 and G1 through 4 of the section that are not used may be deleted, and deleted line numbers added to the space provided for any other of those paragraphs as necessary to accommodate the disclosure of additional items. B, 2 pages. To the extent that adding or deleting line numbers provided under H25 of Appendix H to this part, as permitted by paragraphs T5, Roman numeral 4A of this section, does not accommodate an itemization of all information required to be disclosed by paragraphs F through H on one page. The information required to be disclosed by paragraphs F through H of this section may be disclosed on 2 pages, provided the information required in paragraph H is disclosed on a page separate from the information required in paragraph G. The information required in paragraph G, if disclosed on a page separate from paragraph F, shall be disclosed on the same page as the information required by paragraph H. V, letter V, separation of consumer and seller information. The creditor or settlement agent preparing the form may use form H25 provided to for the disclosure provided to both the consumer and the seller, with the following modifications to set the information of the consumer as to separate the information of the consumer and seller as necessary. 1. The information required to be disclosed in paragraphs J and K of this section may be disclosed on separate pages to the consumer and the seller respectively, with the information required by the other paragraph left blank. The information disclosed to the consumer pursuant to paragraph J of this section must be disclosed on the same page as the information required by paragraph I of this section. Letter B. The information required to be disclosed by paragraph F and G of this section with respect to costs paid by the consumer may be left blank on the disclosures provided to the seller. C. The information required in paragraphs A2, A4, Roman numeral 3, A5, B through D, I, and L through P, R with respect to the creditor and mortgage broker, and S2 of the section may be left blank on the disclosure provided to the seller. Roman numeral 6, modified version of the form for a seller or third party. The information required by paragraphs A2, A4, Roman numeral 3, A5, B through D, F and G with respect to costs paid by the consumer, I, J, L through P, Q1, and R with respect to the creditor and mortgage broker, and S of this section may be deleted from the form provided to the seller on or a third party as illustrated on H25L of the appendix H to this part. Roman numeral 7, transaction without a seller. The following modifications to H25 may be made for a transaction that does not involve a seller and for which the alternative tables are disclosed pursuant to paragraph D, 2, and E of this section as illustrated by form H25J of appendix H to this part. We have A and B. A, the information required by paragraph A4, Roman numeral 2, and paragraphs F, G, and H of this section with respect to costs paid by the seller may be deleted. Letter B, a table under the master heading closing cost details required by paragraph F of this section may be added with the heading payoffs and payments that characterizes the amounts of payments made at closing to other parties from the credit extended to the consumer or funds provided by the consumer in connection with the transaction, including designees of the consumer, the payees, and a description of the purpose of such disbursements under the subheading 2 and the total amount of such payments labeled total payoffs and payments. Letter C, the tables required to be disclosed in paragraphs J and K of the section may be deleted. Roman numeral 8, translation. The form may be translated into languages other than English. The creditors may modify form H25 of appendix H to this part to the extent the transaction prevents the headings, labels, designations, and required disclosure items under the section from fitting the space provided under H25. And customary recitals and information. An additional page may be attached to the form for the purpose of including customary recitals and information used locally in real estate settlements.